Hello folks, and welcome back to another episode of Microsoft 7687 exam covering Windows 8.1. My name is Scott Neal, and today we are going to be covering Lesson 15, Configuring Authentication and Authorization. We're going to be covering exam objective 4.3 today, and there's actually a lot to cover in today's episode. We're going to start off our discussion talking about authentication and authorization. What are the differences between the two? We'll also look at work groups, home groups, and domains from a slightly different light today. We're going to look at it from the standpoint of how we use these to authorize access to resources. And then we'll probably look at local and domain users, discussing the differences between the two. We'll also talk about built-in user accounts and groups that are installed every time you install a version of Windows 8.1. While we're on the topic of groups, we'll probably talk a little bit about these built-in special identity groups as well. They serve a special purpose, and we'll outline that. We'll talk about the nuts and bolts of creating and managing user accounts, logging into the system. Sometime today we'll talk about the configuring of passwords, certain policies, how to change those policies, standard procedures, etc. And probably towards the end of the lecture, we will be finishing up with UAC, the user account, user access control, and elevating privileges. And of course, if we have some extra time, I would like to show you some of these things on our 8.1 machine. So let's go ahead and get started. This lesson is really all about user accounts and how they work. However, before a user can do anything on the network or on the system, that user is going to have to authenticate or successfully log on to that system. So for the purposes of our discussion today, I would like to define authentication as the process of verifying that the identity of the user is the same as the user account that user is attempting to access. Now bear in mind that you can set up your system so that people can authenticate to the system anonymously without validating their identity. However, 99% of the time, that's usually something you don't want to do. Usually you're going to require the user to log in with some sort of piece of information that will validate his or her identity. So there are three methods that we use to do that, and the user will need to provide at least one of those methods to successfully authenticate to the system. First of all, a user can authenticate with something that they would know. Now that usually is a password. Passwords are probably the single most common way that we authenticate to systems and networks in our IT environments. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a password. It could be something as simple as a PIN or a sequence of numbers. Or even some of these newfangled picture passwords that are out. Very common, very similar to what you would see, say, in a banking website. Now, 8.1 supports all three of these methods, and I can go in as a user and look in the sign-in options in the users page under PC settings and choose a particular option I would like to use as part of my login sequence. Now, bear in mind that as an administrator, you have the option to restrict the user to a specific type of login sequence. So it's not necessarily the user's discretion. Authenticating with something the user would have would include something like a smart card. A smart card really is a credit card-like device. It has a special chip built into it, and on that chip we store a digital certificate which helps identify the user. In order for smart cards to work, the operating system has to support Personal Identity Verification Standard. We call that PIV for short. And Windows 7 and later operating systems are capable of natively supporting PIV out of the box. Now, while we're on the topic of smart cards usually also require the user to enter a PIN along with inserting the actual physical card as a measure of security. So anytime we use more than one method to authenticate to a resource or to the device, we are using something that we call multi-factor authentication. Now, multi-factor authentication in most circles is widely regarded as a far more secure way of logging into a resource than just single-factor identification. Now, if you don't want to go around and carry a physical smart card, we can actually incorporate something called a virtual smart card. In order to use virtual smart cards, your computer is going to have to utilize the Trusted Platform module. This is really a dedicated cryptographic chip. It's found in today's newer systems. It emulates the physical card, thereby making the logon process much easier for the user. While we're on the topic of certificates, it's probably a good thing to note that certificates are really used every day by users to authenticate to a wide variety of resources. Things like SSL require certificates. PKI requires certificates. So anytime you log into a banking website, anytime an administrator connects to your laptop while you're out in the field to perform some sort of maintenance, chances are they're doing that authentication process using some sort of certificate. We have to store these certificates on the local machine, and sometimes it becomes necessary to manage those certificates. And so we have a tool for that. That tool is called the Certificates MMC Snapin. So we can go into that Snapin, and then by double-clicking on the installed certificate, we can look at all the information about that certificate. Things like who issued it, who is it issued to, the expiration date, how long is it valid for, has it been revoked. All of this can be found looking at the certificate through the Details panel. Here's an example of a Certificates MMC Snapin off of my own machine. As you can see, I have quite a few certificates already installed. All these certificates serve a wide variety of purposes. Most of them are probably web-based. And on the far lower panel here, you can see I've opened up a particular certificate. In this particular general tab, I'm looking at the issuer, who it's issued to, the validity dates of a certificate, and I can go into the details pane and actually pull up some more details about the certificate as well. How do you get to the Certificates MMC Snapin? Well, we can simply type MMC at the search menu, pull up the MMC Snapin, and then go in and add the Certificate Snapin piece to it, and then we can use that MMC Snapin to manage our certificates. When you're done, if you feel like you're going to be managing certificates on a regular basis, you can save that configuration for your MMC Snapin. Alright, so authenticating with something the user is the third and final method that we use to authenticate the resources. This method of authentication is going to include anything like fingerprints, retina scans, ocular scans, even 3D facial recognition. All these are examples of biometric identification. Now, Windows 8.1 does include a Windows biometric framework to integrate biometric identification. However, it's important to note that, at least up until now, biometric identification is really not reliable enough to be the single method of identification or authentication to a system. Therefore, if you're going to be using biometrics as a method of authenticating to a resource, it's probably a good idea to use multi-factor authentication. Authorization, on the other hand, is the process of granting an authenticated user the appropriate access to a specific resource. Now, this process is going to occur whenever a user attempts to access any resource on the system or on the network, or if they want to perform certain tasks on the device. All of Windows permission systems, by the way, are user-based, and each resource will maintain its own access control lists, as we discussed in Lesson 13. Remember, the resource is going to use its own access control list to authorize users and regulate access to itself. Another user-based element we really haven't discussed yet, but works very similarly to all these permission systems, is user rights. Quite simply, user rights is the term that we use for a way to regulate which users can perform certain tasks on devices. Now, these tasks could be things like remote logon or shutting down a system. All of these tasks that we can do on a particular device requires a certain level of user rights. Here's an example to illustrate the difference between authentication versus authorization. In this particular example, I have a bouncer who's at the door of a club. And the bouncer has a podium, and on the podium he has a guest list. And we have somebody who wants to come. This is Jane. Jane wants to go to the club this evening, but she's going to have to get permission to go into the club. It's a private club. So Jane, who, by the way, earlier went to DMV and provided some sort of proof of her identity, was issued a driver's license. We call that a token, by the way, in our IT world. Jane presents her token to the bouncer. The bouncer looks at the token and says, "Yes, it's a valid token. I believe that you are Jane Wheeler. Let me check my access control list to see if you are authorized to use the club, the resource." He goes in and he actually finds an access control entry for Jane Wheeler. And congratulations, she has VIP access to the club. Now the bouncer could just as easily gone in and found no access control entry for Jane Wheeler, in which case she would not be authorized to use that resource even though she successfully authenticated to it. So, while we're on the topic of talking about these methods of logging into a system or authenticating, let's take this moment to talk a little bit about passwords. As we discussed earlier, we use passwords. A majority of people use passwords to log onto the system. Basically something we know. It is the single most common method used today to authenticate to a network. Now, there are people out there that take advantage of this because a lot of people, a majority of people, if given into their own will, would be using very simple passwords. Passwords that would be easy to remember or linked specifically to something that they know or about themselves. So people take advantage of this and they will attempt to authenticate to a resource and gain unauthorized access to that resource through a method that we refer to as brute force attacks. These are really attacks where evildoers attempt to gain access to the system by repeatedly guessing usernames and passwords. Now, usually they use some sort of automated system to do this that generates passwords and usernames based on a mathematical formula and using something called a rainbow table, which is really a database which has all of the most common usernames and passwords in it to date, and it will run these as fast as the system will accept it until either the system locks them out or until they get successfully authenticated. So in order to reduce the percentage of successful brute force attacks on your network, there are some things that you should consider. First of all, short and simple passwords are mathematically easier to crack. Generally speaking, the longer the password, even if it's a simple password, the sheer length of the password makes it harder to break. For instance, a 7-character password, just characters, has roughly 8 billion password combinations, while a 7-character password, including upper and lowercase characters, will exceed over 1 trillion different possible combinations. Now, if you start throwing in numbers and special characters into that, then that's going to increase the number of combinations exponentially. So as you can see, the longer and more complicated the password, the much harder it becomes to use brute force as a method of authenticating to your resources. Another thing that you can do is require periodic changing of the passwords. This helps deter successful brute force attacks. If your evildoer knows that you are requiring periodic changing of the passwords, then that evildoer is going to have to periodically reset their attempts for particular user accounts and start the whole process all over again. This will quite often discourage a lot of people from attempting brute force attacks on your system. So another good thing to mention is that predictable passwords should always be discouraged. Things like your dog's name, your wife's name, your street address, your favorite car, Things that can be easily tied to the owner of the password should be usually discouraged. Now, as an administrator, looking at this from an administrator side of things, we do have tools in place to help discourage all of these preceding negative practices. So what can we do? Well, one of the things that we can do is we can set password policies for our users. Now this is going to require going in and altering the group policy settings of the device or the domain, depending on how you've got your IT environment set up. Generally speaking, particularly in the corporate world, we set these kind of policies at the domain policy level on the domain controller. However, if you're at home and you're running, say, 8.1 Pro or Enterprise on your little home group network, you can actually go in and set the group policies for your machine as well. You can do this by going into the Windows logo key, opening up the Run dialog box, type gpmc.msc in the text box, click OK, and that Group Policy Management console will come up for you. So what are some common policy practices that you can alter? Well, I've got 3 or 4 or 5 here listed for us to talk about. We could, say, change the way we enforce the password history. By setting this policy, we prevent users from reusing the same password over and over and over again. The setting should always be greater than 1, but I find in corporate settings that this setting is oftentimes set to 10 or even more. Maximum password age can also be altered. This is the number of days the current user's password is valid. In the corporate setting, this is often 90 or even 180 days. Minimum password age can also be set. This setting the minimum password age greater than 1 helps us kind of enforce that password history, because if a user is astute enough, they'll realize that they can just change their password, 6 times or whatever, and go back to using the old password again. We want to discourage this, so we'll say, all right, we'll change it to greater than 1 day, and then if something happens, they'll have to contact an administrator to change that minimum password or get an administrator to change it on the device. The minimum password length should also be changed as well. In corporate settings, this is often 8 to 12 characters. I personally prefer 14 or greater, and I'll tell you why. Because particularly in older versions of Windows, the way if we have password caching enabled on the devices, if we have a password that's less than 14 characters, we can actually, if we're smart enough and gain access to the machine, we can crack that password. And maybe one day I'll incorporate how that's done in a lecture. I can also change the password complexity requirements, and by turning this on, the meets complexity requirements policy, I'm going to require that my password is going to be at least 6 characters long if I haven't changed that minimum password length. I'm going to have to use a combination of at least 3 of the following characters: uppercase, lowercase characters, numbers, symbols, and I also have to make sure that it's not going to contain the user's name or their on-screen name as part of the password. By setting all of these password constraints in group policy, I am helping to ensure that brute force attacks don't successfully occur on my system or on my network. Also, as we discussed in Lesson 13, as far as authorization is concerned, and authorizing users to resources or data resources, we do this by adjusting the NTFS permissions for that specific user or to a group that they are affiliated. We do this under the Security tab under the Properties for any particular resource. We can go into that tab, and under Security, we can manage the access control list for that resource. If you're curious about that, go back and watch Lesson 13 again. Let's move on to workgroups, domains, and home groups. So ever since Windows 3.1 came out, we have used Windows as a means to group together or facilitate the sharing of resources, including data. And today, with the latest version of Windows, there are 3 methods for establishing relationships between resources on a network. Let's spend a little time reiterating these and talking a little bit about how we authorize those resources with these particular methods. The most simple and the method that's been around the longest is workgroups. It is the simplest of methods and really the default configuration of any Windows system today. It represents a collection of computers that are all peers on the network. So, if I have a group of computers together in a room and they're all set up as workgroups, it's important to remember that even though these computers can work together, or you can, as a user, connect to these computers, each computer will have its own set of users and groups which must be managed. Now, if you're an astute administrator, you can do little tricks like make sure that the same user has the same account and password on all of those computers. That's going to help simplify things a little bit. But if it ever comes time to change that password, you'll have to touch every physical box. I can do pass-through authentication, provided the same user account and password is going to be implemented on all systems in the workgroup. This makes the workgroup thing a little easier. Now, with that said, this is still a very labor-intensive way of managing data and resources on a network. So when Windows NT came out, we started looking at domains. Domain computers utilized a central database that's called a directory service in order to authenticate and authorize access to resources. Domains use the directory service, and that directory service is a collection of logical objects representing a wide variety of resources on the network. Things like computers, other networked devices, servers, printers, data, applications, groups, and even the users themselves are considered a resource in this environment. The nice thing about domains is that I can centrally manage as an administrator and secure those resources on the network, making my time as an administrator much more efficient and productive. That's why domains are the most common method utilized by organizations to date for, organizations, businesses. If you go in and work in one of these locations, you're going to be working, chances are, on a domain environment. And of course, the Windows servers where Active Directory domain services are installed, we call those domain controllers. And in organizations, we like to have more than one domain controller running just for a little bit of redundancy. The third and final method of authorizing resources is the home groups. The home groups is fairly new. It's been out since Windows 7, and it's really a good compromise for home users looking to easily share resources. We're going to be using a few computers, a few resources, and we want to set up a way to share data between those, but we don't want to really use a complex domain infrastructure. Home groups allow the sharing of libraries among other systems within the same home group. Now, the system has to be connected to a home network, and a passkey will be configured on the original machine that you set up on the home group, and then we will go in and add that passkey to other systems as we implement that home group on those systems. We discussed home groups in a little more detail in Lesson 13 if you're interested. So let's move on to understanding local and domain users and groups. So let's talk a little bit about local users. Local users is probably what most homeowners are familiar with. So with the exception of domain controllers, all Windows systems have the ability to manage local users. Domain controller, when you convert it over to a domain controller, all the local users go away. They become domain users. But all of our systems, whether they're on a domain or whether they are standalone systems at home, have the ability to have local user accounts. 3 local accounts are always created by default when the operating system is installed. The administrator account and the guest accounts, which in Windows 8.1 and actually from Windows 7 up, are always disabled by default. And there's also a default user account. We call that the new user account. It's created during the installation process. This is the account you're probably familiar with where it says, enter your name and that kind of thing. It's important to note that the new user account is not the administrator account. The administrator account, as I said before, is disabled by default. Now, in a corporate setting, we as administrators may choose to enable the administrator account and use it as a backdoor for our staff to get into the system. And that's perfectly fine. I would recommend, however, that if you're going to do that, you're going to want to change that administrator account name. Be sure to put a strong password on it so that it's not easy for someone to attempt a brute force attack on. Local accounts can be managed in the Local Users and Groups Snapin under the Control Panel. Go into the Control Panel, Administrative Tools, and Computer Management to find this Snapin. Local users and groups are device specific. I can't use them to authenticate or manage other systems. As far as the administrator account goes, just to reiterate, it is disabled by default. The administrator account is part of the administrators group, therefore it's going to have complete unbridled access to the system, and it's always created during installation. The guest account is designed for users needing temporary or rudimentary access to the system. It too is disabled by default. And of course, during that installation process, that new user account is created, and the installer will set up a default login account that we call the new user account for a typical login session. This is what a home user is familiar with as far as logging into the system. In addition to local users, local groups can also be configured through the Local Users and Groups MMC Snapin or under the User Account app. Local groups can help us restrict access to a device. Therefore, permissions can only be configured for resources functioning or housed on the same device. Therefore, these local groups can only be used on the device they were created. Now, domain systems can have domain users and domain global groups as members in a local group. Using a domain group and adding it to the local administrator group, for example. This would allow my administrators, even though they log in with a domain access, they can actually administrate the local machine. Local groups, however, cannot have local groups as members. Now, there are 18 different default local groups that are set up during the operating system installation, and each one has a different set of access characteristics. Obviously, I don't have time to outline all 18 of these. However, some of the groups you may be familiar with would include the administrators group, backup operators, guests, performance log users, power users, remote desktop users, and of course the standard or default user group account users. Domain users, on the other hand, are a different story. There are some fundamental differences between local users and domain users. For instance, only one domain user account needs to be created to allow that user access to multiple systems on a domain network. We call that single sign-on. Matter of fact, in a domain, we actually discourage the use of adding local user accounts on the boxes, except in very rare exceptions, or maybe laptops that are going to, Tahiti or something. You use different tools also to manage domain users. These domain accounts are going to reside on a domain controller and are added to a local machine or to an affiliated group through the user's control panel in order to provide access. And there are many more properties associated with domain user accounts, giving me as an administrator a lot more granular control of what that user can and cannot do on the network. So domain user accounts generally are considered much more secure. Domain groups function in a similar manner as domain users. Only one domain group account will need to be created. That account can be used all over the network to facilitate authorization to resources. You use different tools to manage these domain groups. Same tools that you would use to manage domain users, we can go in and add groups as well. Then we can actually nest our users in particular groups and then add those groups to specific resources, allowing us a much easier way to administer these resources. So using domain groups to tailor access is generally considered a much more secure way of managing them. And of course, I can centrally manage these resources in that manner. As far as logging into a domain system, let's look at, there are some basic differences between logging into a local system and logging into a domain system. They're really two different worlds. So let's take this example here. This computer is named Scott1, and this computer was added to the Telar domain. So even though we don't normally associate prefixes as a way that we log into our systems, they're really there. So the prefix for all local accounts for this particular system would be Scott1. Therefore, if I wanted to log in to this account and my username was SJN, my login would be Scott1 /SJN. Now, on workgroup systems, that Scott1 is pretty much inferred. It's not really necessary to type that in. However, if you are on a domain system, the domain prefix, of course, for this system would be Telar. And to log into that Telar domain, if I had an account named ScottN, I would log in as Telar /ScottN. Now, most domain systems, once you've logged into a domain, it's going to default to that domain every time a user logs into the system until you decide to log in with another domain account or another local user account. But generally speaking, we cache the domain or the local machine as part of the prefix for that user. So where does this get complicated? Say you are an administrator and you are logging into a local into a computer system that's a domain computer system, but you for some reason need to log in with the local administrator account. So you type Scott1 /administrator and you log into the system. You do what you need to do, you log out of the system and you go on your merry way. Well, the next user that logs into the system probably doesn't have a local account on that system. You've given that user a domain account to log into that system. Well, that creates a problem because when the user tries to log into that system, it's going to default to that local user or local account prefix to try to log that user in, Scott1. Now, the user doesn't know anything about this. The user used the same account for years. He's not going to notice at the very bottom of the screen where it says logging into Scott1, and he's not going to know what that means anyway. So he's going to call the administrator and he's going to say, I can't log into the system. Well, that's because it's cached the wrong prefix for that particular user. Therefore, if you're an administrator and you find that you've logged in with a local administrator account or a local account to fix something on the machine, as a courtesy, go back in and log back in with your domain account in order to rectify that problem for your next user. So we talked about local accounts, we talked about domain accounts, we talked about local groups. There's another type of group out there that we associate as groups, but we don't manage them the same way as we manage groups. So as far as local groups and domain groups go, as an administrator, we add people to those groups, we nest them or do what we need to do for those groups in order to manage resources. But there's this special identity group is a different thing altogether. It's essentially a placeholder group, and it's always dynamically changing. Now, Windows 8.1 has 20 of these such groups. And we've used special identity groups for a long time in many different incarnations of operating systems. We can change the properties, the names, and the rights of these groups like any other group. However, I don't manage the users within that group. The individual circumstances at any given moment will determine who's a part of that group or the group membership. So, for instance, authenticated users. Authenticated users is a special identity group. Users will come and go out of this group depending on whether they successfully logged into the system or the domain. As soon as, say, I've logged into my system, I become an authenticated user. Now, as an administrator, I can use that authenticated user group or control access through that authenticated user group. I just can't really dictate who is going to be a part of that group at any given moment. That's what makes these special identity groups. Now, there's a whole host of other special identity groups, things like remote desktop users and so on. Okay? So it's important to remember that we cannot control the membership of special identity groups, even though we can administer other aspects of these groups, and in some ways it can actually be very advantageous for us to do so for each of these 20 groups. Configuring users and groups, there are really two ways to create and manage local user accounts. We can do it, for instance, through the control panel applet. You can create and modify user accounts, but you cannot create groups or manage memberships except the administrator group. Now, how we do this? Well, from the desktop, we select the control panel, accounts and family safety, and user accounts, or if we're smart, we can just do a search for user. We can also go in and more granularly control local users and groups through the user and groups MMC Snapin, as we discussed earlier. This is the traditional method, the method we've used for many years, to provide unfettered access to user and group accounts. It's really designed more for technical specialists. We can do this through the control panel under Administrative Tools, Computer Management, Local User and Groups, or by going in and doing a search or run and type lusrmgr.msc. Okay, that stands for Local User Manager.msc. Press enter and that Snapin will come up for you. A lot of times you're going to be prompted by the user account control. We haven't talked about that yet, but trust me, you will. Just select yes, and you'll have to, of course, have administrator privileges on the machine to access these functions. So, I mentioned UAC. What is UAC anyway? Well, the user account control was introduced in Windows Vista, and it was really designed to prevent unauthorized changes to the system, including damaging the system or allowing malware to install. Now, I have to admit, when Windows Vista came out with UAC, it was a royal pain in the butt. But they have improved on it, tweaked it, and it's not nearly as bad and still provides the functionality it really needs to provide. Now, unlike older versions of Windows, administrators receive two separate tokens upon login: a standard user token and the traditional administrative token. The UAC will invoke and verify the use of that administrative token through the use of what we call the elevation prompt, when called upon to perform a task that's going to require elevated privileges. You know, things like, well, like the one we just talked about, adding a new user. Invoking the administrative token to accomplish a managerial task is known as invoking the admin approval mode, and this places the desktop into secure desktop mode. Microsoft only recommends logging in with the administrative account to perform management tasks on the system or on the domain. When you think about it, this makes sense. The practice of using the standard account until called upon to manage these specific system resources, and then only granting those users and administrators enough privileges to accomplish their roles is called practicing the principle of least privilege. Like an administrator, a standard user attempting to perform an administrative function on the system is going to be prompted with a credential prompt, where they're going to have to supply a password and an administrative account in order to accomplish that task. We can also elevate our privileges by using the run as command. Okay, we can do that from the GUI. From the GUI, we right-click on the executable and select Run as Administrator. From the Run box or the command prompt, it's a little more complicated, but we can granularly control it. We use the Run as command, and we have a format for that. We have the Run as /user, the domain or local system prefix, and the user account name, the program that we're trying to invoke that elevated permissions on, and any path to specific program files that we may need to run. So an example would be run as user Scott1 administrator. I'm going to run the Notepad program, and I'm going to run a particular script. I can also type, if I just want to run Notepad, I can do that too. Run as user tester. In this particular instance, because this computer is not on the domain, it's going to, by default, associate Scott1 as the prefix, notepad.exe. We call this elevating privileges. All right, that wasn't so bad. Let's summarize today. Authentication really is the process of verifying that the identity of the user is the same as the user account the user is attempting to access, while authorization is the process of granting an authenticated user the appropriate access to specific resources. Now, authentication to a resource can involve providing something we know, or indeed something we have, or something we are. Or we can use a combination of those three methods, a process that we call multi-factor authentication. And while we're on the topic of passwords, the most common form of authentication, it's important to note that longer, more complex passwords are going to be more difficult to crack using these brute force methods. And if we want to facilitate good practices, we can do that for passwords through 8.1 because it does ship with a Credential Manager to securely store passwords for our users. So this Credential Manager allows our users not to have to remember anything but one password. They can go into the Credential Manager and look up other passwords as they need to because managing a whole lot of passwords is difficult for all of us. We can also alter the password policies via group policy MMC Snapins through 8.1 Pro or Enterprise Editions or on our domain controller to help facilitate better password practices. Sharing resources, of course, is vital for maintaining productive environments. It's really what IT environments is all about in this day and age. We can do that through three methods: workgroups, home groups, and domains. And the option that you're going to choose will depend on the purpose and the complexity of the network environment that you're running. Local accounts and groups are only relevant to the local machine that they reside on, while domain accounts and groups allow users to utilize the same account throughout the network, making it a lot easier for your administrator to manage those resources and to access and utilize those resources. By default, 3 local accounts will always be created during the operating system installation: the administrator account, the guest account, which are both disabled, and the new user account, or the account that the user is most familiar with. All but the new user account, I cannot stress enough, will be disabled by default as a measure of security. There are 20 default local user accounts, more so to tailor specific user rights to the box than to control access to data resources. There are 2 ways to create and manage user accounts: through the control panel applet or through the local users and groups MMC Snapin, their traditional method. And user account control, or UAC, which was introduced in Windows Vista, is really there to prevent unauthorized changes to the system, things like damaging it or installing malware. And I mentioned user rights in this chapter. User rights are policies that define specific operating system functions for a particular user. So that's it for lesson 15. Now we'll move on to the demo section. Okay, folks, welcome back to the demonstration segment for today's lesson 15 Windows 8.1 discussion. I wanted to take a moment today to show you a couple different ways, other than the ways we've demonstrated in previous demonstrations, to get into the local user and groups MMC Snapin and to work with local users and groups in general. I want to focus a little bit more on setting up a local group today and discuss some of the benefits of using local groups. I also want to take a moment while we're in the MMC Snapin to talk about certificates, or at least show you how to get into the certificates MMC Snapin. We'll move from there and we'll go into looking at group policy, and we'll talk about group policy passwords. We'll talk about UAC, and maybe we'll even look at that whole password credentials utility that will allow me to store my passwords so I don't have to remember as many passwords as a typical user is generally faced with in today's IT environment. So I wanted to start off today in the system menu, and you go into control panel, system, and I wanted to show you this because of a couple things. First of all, we had talked about how computers live in two worlds when a computer is on the domain. There's the local world, and then there's the domain world. And I wanted to show you that it's very easy from the system interface to, first of all, show you that we are in a work group. If this was a domain system, it would tell us the name of the domain that this computer would be in, and the computer name, which this is the computer name right here, this WinJJOG6SIV63F. This is really the automated computer name that was automatically generated upon creation of the operating system. We can go in and we can make changes to this, however, by hitting the Change Settings button, going in here, and it reiterates our information, hit Change again, and here I can actually change the local computer name. I can also add this computer to a domain, and if I had a domain controller available to me today, I would do this for you, but I don't. You do have to have, of course, a domain present in your IT environment. That domain controller also has to be set up and pointed to through your DNS server. DNS and domains are hand in hand. You have to have DNS working. And so I could have easily go in here and say TLR, and I could hit OK. And it would change my computer name. It would prompt me for the username and password for an account that's authorized to add computers to the TLR domain. Typically, this would be the domain administrator account, but of course, the domain administrator could also authorize other users or other groups the ability to add computers to the domain. Since I don't have my TLR domain controller available to me, we get this lovely error message. But anyways, I wanted to show you this very quickly because this is another one of those bread and butter things that you are kind of expected to know as an administrator how to do. I promise that when I get around to doing my Server 2012 lecture series for R2, we will follow this process to fruition. All right, but let's get on with the meat and potatoes of today's demonstration. I want to go in and we're going to run our local users and groups MMC Snapin today. So here we have, we're going to type LUSR for local user manager mgr.mse. We're going to hit OK, and we're going to invoke the local users and groups MMC Snapin. Now, once we've done that, you can see we've created some users in previous demos, and we've changed this administrator account. We changed this administrator account for security reasons, and if I go into the properties, you can see it's a member of administrators. And if I go into this new user account, this is the new user account that was set up during the install of the operating system, and look at the properties, it's actually a member of administrators and users. So, but today I want to focus on creating a group. I'm going to say new group, and as you can see, we have several. If you see all these groups, these were installed during the install process of our operating system. Now, users, of course, is the default group, anytime you create a user, it's going to add them by default to the users group. And of course, the guest and the administrators group are here as well as backup operators, event log readers, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we can use these groups to tailor our user rights for our system. And indeed, if you go in and look at these groups in more detail, you will see that a lot of these have already been pre-configured for you. Now, I've also added a couple other groups in here. I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to delete this because I don't need them anymore, and I'm going to delete this one. These are just groups that I've created for other demos. But I'm going to go in and add a group. So let's go in and say new group. And we're going to call this test group, test group. We're going to hit enter. Okay. And I can close that. And as you can see, I've created a test group. Now this test group has nobody in it. I could have added people at the time I created the group, but I can also go in and I can say add to group, or I can go into the properties and add a member this way and say Jane. Okay, so and hit that. Okay, so why create groups? Well, we use groups to allow us to add multiple users with similar properties to resources that they need access to. So, an example of this would be, say, a folder containing financial data. And I may have 10 or 50 or 100 people that need access to that financial data. Well, adding 100 people individually to that folder is a real pain in the neck. But I could add them to a group, particularly in a domain. I could add them to a group and have that group set up on all the particular folders that they need access to. And I don't have to add them individually to that folder as they come and go out of the financial office. I can just simply add them to the financial group, and that will take a lot of effort off of me as an administrator as far as keeping track of what access that they have to what resources. And the nice thing about that is if you go into the user's properties, it will actually tell you what groups they're a member of, but it won't tell you what resources they're a member of. You have to run a whole utility to do that. It takes hours to run. So this is a very common sense, easy way to manage access for a majority of our users. I recommend this as your predominant means of controlling access, particularly in a domain environment. Maybe not so important on a local machine, but you can do the same thing on a local machine as well. Alright, so let's close out of this and let's go into the MMC Snapin again. Just type MMC, and this time, by the way, here's the user account control in action, right? Because I have administrative privileges, I'm not being prompted for my credentials, but I do still have to authenticate. So I'm going to go in and I am going to add another Snapin. Let's add the certificate Snapin for now. I'm going to add it for my user account. You have three options. I could add one. I could check the Snapin for my computer account and see what certificates are specifically for the computer. I could even check to see what certificates are allocated to my service account or a service account. A service account is really a user account that's being used by some sort of an application or utility to provide a service to one machine or many machines on a network. An example of that would be something like a backup utility. Maybe I'm running in a domain, I'm running a backup utility service off of a server somewhere and it's taking everything off my local machines and putting it on a server. That's fine, but I have to authenticate to each of those machines with an account. And I'm in the interest of least privilege, I'm going to create a service account that can only back up the systems, nothing else. And then I'm going to add that account to each of those systems, add that account to the utility, and the utility will use that account to authenticate to each of those local systems to pull that data off. That's what a service account does in a nutshell. I'm just going to say my user account, hit finish, hit OK, and then we can actually go in. Let's see, personal certificates. I have one student, that's me. I can look in the properties and I can see that I have several different options available for me. I can create a friendly name. I can enable all purposes for the certificate, disable or enable the following purposes. In this case, this is by default set up for our EFS encrypting file system. This was essentially the certificate that was created for me in my PKI when I did my earlier demonstration and set up EFS for a particular file. Okay, so that's the certificate for my EFS, for my account. Now, there are other certificates out there. We can go in and we can look at Active Directory objects. We don't have Active Directory running, so there shouldn't be any user objects there if I'm on a domain or something. How about untrusted certificates? These are certificates that we don't trust. Third-party roots verification certificates, we do have a few of those, and I can go into the properties. I can look at and identify and analyze some of these certificates as I see fit. All right, so the certificates console does allow me to go in and manage specific certificates. I can also go in and export certificates out and save them as a means of backing up my certificates in case something gets corrupted. All right, what else can we talk about today? I'm going to just close out of this. Oh, I know what we can talk about. Let's go in and change our password policies. So I believe in my lecture, I talked about running gpmc.msc. I'm going to get an error message. I'm going to tell you why I get an error message, and that is because previous versions of Windows use the gpmc.msc to invoke the Group Policy Management Console. We don't do that anymore. In Windows 8.1, it's actually changed to gpedit.msc, and that actually is consistent with the command line interface that we've used for years. But this brings up the local computer policy for our machine. Now, I would like to point out that if you are running a domain, if you're a domain administrator, you have a domain group policy as well. There's a default group policy, there's a group policy for domain controllers, and you can create group policies for organizational units as well. And each of those can be tailored to meet specific needs. For us today, we're going to go into the Windows settings. We're going to go into the security settings. Under account policies, we're going to open that and we're going to look at these password policies that we can change for our local machine. Now, if I did this on the domain controller, I would be changing password policies on a domain level. That means all the machines that are affected by those domain policies would have their policies changed, and all the user accounts would have those policies changed. We can go in, let's just say password age, we can go in and we can change that maximum password age to however many days we want a user to use that password. Okay. So we have the ability to go into the local group policy editor as a local administrator on this box and make our users conform to whatever best practices we deem appropriate for that box as far as passwords go. Now, group policy, involves a lot of other things too, including user rights management. We touched on user rights in today's lecture. I wanted to show you that there are literally dozens of different types of user rights that we can associate to either those default groups that have been pre-configured for those user rights, like backing up files and directories. Administrators can do that as well as backup operators. This is pre-configured out of the box. And you can use these user accounts that were built into the operating system to help you tailor roles as far as, say, we have a backup utility. We can create a group, add it to the backup operators group, and it will automatically have the user rights needed to back up the system files. So we can use these to our advantage. We can also go in and create specific groups and add those groups for the user rights. So we're not just limited to the pre-configured or the pre-installed groups. We can create our own groups and tailor them to specific user rights on this system to do specific tasks. Okay, let's move on to the next thing today. So let's go into the control panel, and let's go into another way that we can go in and manage user accounts is, of course, through user accounts down here. And here we can see that there's yet another method. As I always joke, there's always 3 ways to do something in Windows. And here's another way that we can do that. We can go in and we can change my account name, and with administrative privileges, I can manage other accounts and change other account control settings, user account control settings. Here is that user account control that I was talking about in our lecture. And here we can change the intensity, the level in which we want user account control invoked on our system. At what point do we want to invoke that user account control? This was something that Vista was kind of lacking desperately in. They have gone through and made this much simpler to use. For instance, I can turn it off so that user account control just doesn't work. It just is completely off. That's not recommended. Or I can raise it up until I reach my appropriate comfort level based on my security needs for this machine. Okay. Now, one last thing before we close up shop for the evening. I do want to show you this Manage Your Credentials utility here. This allows me to go in and set passwords for my users or for myself. I can add a Windows credential, and I can create with a username and password and create a network address and whatever, and I can use these credentials or store these credentials in my Credential Manager for future use. This allows or takes some of the burden off of me as far as having to remember the potentially dozens of passwords that a typical user over the lifetime of being in an IT environment may be forced to remember. Okay, so that's a pretty quick demo for the day. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you for our next topic of discussion in our Windows 8.1 tutorial course. I hope you have a great day.